Okay, thank you for coming out on this cold winter night to find out about calligraphy in the digital age, how we got here and where we are going. I think I'll do a good job in telling you how we got here. Where we're going is an open question. I'll answer that right away. But it's a question, this whole concept has been presented to me. I started my professional career as a calligrapher at pretty much the birth of the digital age for lettering. And I remember very clearly at the beginning of my career as a calligrapher, people like my dad saying, "Why are you doing that? The computer will be doing that for you any time now." And that has happened. Calligrapher's work has changed tremendously, the commercial work. But as we see through this little journey here, it's alive and well. So I used to like to think that it began here, and it does. Calligraphy, beautiful writing, the human desire to communicate. 30 to 60,000 years ago, these dates for these things. Cave drawings, pictograms. This is the first time that visual art transcended time in communication. You could, before that, communication had to be face-to-face. Up until after that, when you had this, you could start transcending thoughts, ideas, and facts through an asymmetric communication. So not too long after, another 20, 30,000 years, they started coming up with proto-writing, ideographic mnemonic symbols to convey limited information. These were not alphabets. This is early ideographic, you might call it writing, you might call it symbols, and it happened all over the world. The Vinca symbol, Southeastern Europe, Syria. This is the seal of the city of Mesopotamia. So these are early, this actually is about 600 years before cuneiforms in the same part of the world. And then all the way over here in the Americas, we had Mayan glyphs 3,000 years old. So communication was becoming more involved, visual communication. We go back to the Jaihu symbols and the Oracle bone script, and you could carry that communication, so it didn't just have to be in one place. And then we get to where alphabets begin. This is still not yet calligraphy. This is the first alphabetical systems, proto-alphabetic, the cuneiforms in Mesopotamia. And at this point, about this time in hieroglyphs, writing did become popular. It was often restricted to nobility and people in high government service. It was restricted knowledge, you might say. But it was also considered so important that cultures had deities like Metrodon and Sheshat and Thoth, all these gods, because writing was considered at that point so critically important. And of course, if you've got gods, you've got demons. This is our demon, Titivolus, the little guy on the left. And he still lives. He's alive and well. And then along came hieroglyphs after the cuneiform shortly afterwards. And this is, of course, the Egyptian logographic writing system. And that led to the Phoenician alphabet. I personally, I look at those two and I don't see the association, but paleographers for years have associated this and have confirmed that the Phoenician alphabet was born from that. So this was the first Proto-Sinaitic script, spread through the Mediterranean over hundreds of years, and it influenced the Greek alphabet, which this is inscribed. The Greek alphabet early was a monoline alphabet done with a monoline stylus, and in this case carved. And the growth of those alphabets is shown here in that chart. And I have to tell you, I look at some of those images and I don't know how they evolve from one shape to the other, but that's what the paleographers do for us. And then this is where in my own personal studies, in my estimation, our Western calligraphy begins. So not to discount writing systems all over the world for so many years, thousands of years before that. But this being the Trajan column in the first century Rome, this is one of the finest examples of imperial Romans. We, as calligraphers, all embody this as the finest model. One of the most famous students of this work was Father Edward Katich from the United States. He's noted for the fullest development of the thesis that these letters were first made with brush. There's a bonus tonight for whoever can answer who's the first person noted to have considered that they were first done by brush. I don't remember who it was, but when somebody tells me, I'll know. Anyways, you'll see the thicks and thins and the serifs, and this is really where we've gone forward with our alphabet. Now, at the same time, this is what most people in Rome wrote at that time. This is writing. This is writing to a friend, writing a novel, a poem, and calligraphy kind of has managed to work its way using both of these very formal structures and informal structures to find its way through this great history of writing, working from top to bottom. And we're going to quickly go through this little history here through time. But I want you to notice the humanist in the times. The humanist hand was developed in the early Renaissance in the 15th century and has certainly influenced us for years and years and years. And Times Roman is highly inspired by that, as well as Carolingian, and we'll get to that. So the rustic caps, these the earliest recorded rustic caps were actually 22 BC, but they weren't used until about the first century broadly, and they were painted. There's some great samples of these that have been preserved in Pompeii. It was used broadly by scribes all the way until the Gothic period for header type for titling. A little bit later, now this still says first century, and these none of these are cut fast except for the invention of the printing press, but all of these hands part are very, very broad dates. This is square capitals or capitalis quadrata. Note that it's got a more natural pen angle than the structured formal Romans. They use a square cut pen in a more comfortable position. You see like the letter O is kind of, its axis is not vertical, it's on a slant. And the humanist went back to this hand in the 15th century to develop a unified uppercase, lowercase, minuscule, majuscule alphabet. From the square Romans, we went into the uncial phase. And this is an early uncial. This is Greek uncial that was done in 350 AD, but in fact, the Latin uncial wasn't adopted until about the 4th century. The rounded strokes allowed for faster writing than earlier constructed letters, and later on the use of parchment sped things up with the writing with this hand as well. The Latin uncial was developed from emerging of the characteristics of cursive and Roman caps. So what they were doing is breaking away from square caps and drawing from where I said that the regular cursive that people were writing. So they're trying to speed up their work. The notable characteristics of these uncial hands is the F, the I, the P, the S, and the T are quite narrow. The S in this alphabet is a precursor to the narrow S in future scripts. The M, the N, and the U are very broad, and the M has rounded arches on both the outsides. It's very, very broad. We hear uncial, it's a big term in the calligraphy world because it had really broad use from Africa to Turkey to Ireland and more. And then many, many variations that spread through the Christian church. A couple hundred years later, we got into the half uncial. It's not related to the uncial technically. It was born of the same thing. They were inspired by the cursive of the day, and the formal writing, and they came up with a half uncial, smaller than uncial. Uncial, by the way, meaning 1 inch in the old Roman inch system. But it also had ascenders and descenders. That's a critical element of this. It was brought to Ireland in the 5th century. It was then carried to England. And about this time, Rome was well gone. And Ireland started, the British Islands started creating the insular hands, and this was the basis of those. And they became more compressed over time. And here's the Book of Durrow, the insular hand, which was kind of later into the 7th century. Now we get into some real fun illumination examples instead of these formal hands. Here's the Lindisfarne Gospel. A little break away from formal lettering there. If you look at these things, all these old manuscripts, the illumination on this stuff looks oftentimes like modern work. It's just fascinating. Look at this playful T in the Book of Kells with little gargoyles and stuff in it. So then came along Carolingian in the 6th and 11th century. I can hardly say enough about this hand because it is the root of the humanist hand. It's the root of Times Roman. It's named after King Charles the Great in 796. He commissioned an English scholar, Alcuin of York, to create an easily read, easily written hand as a standard for the lands that he covered. King Charles was very close to the church. He wanted to spread the word of the church. He wanted to bring literacy to the land, and by creating a unified script, that helped a lot, and it also helped to create more books, more literature. Scholars, and then this hand, it just comes back and back again through history. During the Renaissance, the Italian scholars who were creating new works, new hand, the humanist hand itself, looked for this for reference. Edward Johnston looked at this back in another Renaissance years later, hundreds of years later, and used it to create his foundational hand. He thought it was just a perfect hand for that. This is an insular version of Carolingian. Carolingian was so important that Gudrun von Zapf created this hand after the creator of Carolingian, Alcuin. Then came the Gothic hands. So these, while the Italians gave the Gothic hands their name Gothic, but they were referring to the Goths and the barbarians of the north, but it's argued that the design influence could have been born from the Saracenic or Muslim influences with their horseshoe peaks and the strong peaks of their buildings and arches. And that influence had come in through the Moors from the south. Or it's also considered that they were replicating architecture of its time, and this concept, this thought through Europe that vertical reaching up to heaven, everything going vertical and high, so we've left the horizontal plane and have gone vertical, working towards the heavens. So that's a really tightly compressed vertical hand. And here's, that's where I figured that those arches there, being the Moorish influence, might reflect those arches, but Gothic did as well, so they both served that. In the 13th century, we got into rotunda. Southern Europe, Italy and Spain, didn't take to the Gothic quite as easily as the northern countries and areas in France, and they had more of a Mediterranean influence. So they came up with this rotunda. We see influences from Carolingian in here, and with Gothic. The rhythm is pretty poor. You see these really, really wide round letters, and then the tight kind of Gothic where all the verticals come together. It makes it hard to read with that broken rhythm. But because they were around when the printing press was first created, or Gutenberg press anyways, that was became a very popular influence for type. So the people getting tired of reading the Gothic hand, it was laborious on the eye to read those lines and lines of text like that. And the beginning of the Renaissance and the humanist period, where they're going back to the antiquities and more classic design influences, brought about the humanist hand, which is almost as significant as the Carolingian hand in what we do. The biggest difference here between the Gothic, of course, it's broader. That's a result of a flatter pen angle, a little faster to write. And the significant designers of this is Poggio Bracciolini. He is noted for design, for pretty much coming up with this vertical humanist hand. And his colleague or associate friend, Niccolò Nicolai, was the one who created the italic version at the same time. It's a detail of that. And again, if you look at the structure of those humanist letters and architecture, Roman architecture of its time, those perfect arches, not too tall like the Gothic. And this also, like the black letter or textura, was popular at the time of the creation of the first movable type printing presses. So it too became a very popular early font, early typeface. So there it is, 1455. It certainly wasn't the end of the development of writing. The scribes still worked as writing teachers. Literacy was on the rise. Commerce was on the rise. Europe was growing. They were coming. Education, the churches weren't ruling things anymore, the universities. At this time, it was common for a very wealthy person to have as many as 50 scribes building their library for them, copying books. So it was a pretty critical thing to come up with. When it was created, there were approximately 30,000 books in Europe at that time, of course, all hand done. And within 50 years, there were more than 9 million books in Europe because of that device. And there's a picture of one of the Gutenberg Bibles. And there's the type, both forward and reverse for that. I would imagine, I'm not a type designer, but I would imagine that this textura type font would be fairly easy to set, in that the letters go right up to the edge and they almost touch each other, so there's not much in the way of spacing's got to be pretty easy. So we had the printing press. Calligraphers all of a sudden weren't copying books by the hundreds, but they were still creating, and more people wanted to learn to write, and the way to write was through copybooks. And this is Arrighi. La Operina, it was the first published book on how to write italic script, and many modern type designers, Stanley Morrison, Frederick Ward, Robert Slimbach, who did Adobe Jensen Italic, and Johnson Hofler have all been inspired by this. And there was also at the time Palatino, who had written a book, the new book to learn how to write all the ancient and modern letters of all nations. And this was a copybook for many hands. It was very popular for through the mid-16th century. I find it interesting to find this really fun stuff happening in the 16th century. And I think it's, I would attribute that to the freedom that calligraphers had, that they no longer had to be bound to the book. You know, perhaps it's kind of, we get into that future with the digital revolution and how much it's freed our hands. And this is really turning lettering as communication into lettering as art. Here's more exemplar books, really popular stuff. It's gone nuts. And this is in France in the 17th century. And then, of course, there was George Bickham in the mid-18th century. He wrote a book called The Universal Penman. It had 212 broadsides, each one focusing on a different art, profession, emotion, or human moral. This book is still in print. It's absolutely fantastic. I recommend everybody to own it. And these books, when they were first made, weren't for decorative purposes. They're really showy, but they were to exemplify legible and easier styles of business hands for clerks and other jobs whose necessitated a lot of writing. If you think about when this was, the Industrial Revolution was happening, but there was no typewriter yet. Commerce was just outrageous, and everything had to be documented. So you couldn't be writing in these really nice, pretty bookhands and still be fast. So they started working with these cut quills and getting the thicks and thins through pressure, and started coming up with rapid, legible writing. And this English round hand became kind of erroneously called copperplate. That name is just close because of its close association with engravers. So now we're going to come over to America. We've gone through Europe. America's been born, and what was going on here at the same time? I love America. I'm glad to be an American, but I think of all of our great documents, I've seen better. So that's it. The person who wrote this is Timothy Matlack. He was from Pennsylvania. He was a secretary to Thomas Jefferson, and he had nice handwriting, period. That's it. He did not seek out a scribe, in the calligraphic sense anyways. Jacob Shallis did this. He was an assistant clerk, another government person with a pretty good hand, and that's it. These are great documents, but the art is sorely lacking. So at this time, Charles Zahner, you've probably all heard of the Zahner-Bloser Company, which Zahner started the Zahnerian Art College, and then later on the Zahnerian College of Penmanship. So think about that. Here we are, we're still 20 years before the typewriter or something, and that volume of writing is just incredible. They had colleges of penmanship with rooms this big full of people just learning how to write neatly. And he's known for publishing this book, which also is still in publication. I own one. I've owned several over my career. And there's a really interesting comment in the beginning. He says that he refers to men, but he says a young man can make up to $5 an hour, and it's still true. So. We got into this period in America we call the golden age of penmanship. And it was kind of a little bit like during the Renaissance, before the printing press. Penmanship and writing and these visual things really, really became important. Diplomas, resolutions, awards, all that kind of stuff. So lettering arts were in high demand. Advertising was really getting big at this point. And some of the Americans who started this movement were William Dennis, William Baird, Platt Rogers, Zahner, Elmer Bloser, and Louis Madaraz. And this period, it coincided with the birth of commercial art. Just beautiful work. Beautiful, beautiful work. That's part of a large resolution. And there we go. There's Frank Mason Robinson. He's from Maine, and he had a friend in Maine called E.L. Brown, who was also big in the American penmanship movement. Platt Roger Spencer, Spencerian script. It's really one of the few, if not the only, calligraphic hands that was really kind of born here, that's kind of taken off as an actual hand. But I can't find much of Platt Roger Spencer's work himself, which is interesting. But anyways, he created ornamental penmanship, known for its big ovals, nice, easy, smooth lines, and fast. So he taught that as a business hand in America. And a student, Austin Palmer, one of his students, narrowed it down and simplified it even more, and it became the Palmer method. The Palmer method, it included total muscle motion. So the more proximal muscles of the arm were used for movement, and the fingers or hands were left out. He printed a book teaching this, Palmer's Guide to Business Writing. In 1912, 1 million copies were sold through the United States, and he won the gold medal at the Panama Pacific Exhibition in San Francisco for that book. And then came the writing machine. And the American Penman periodical actually came out with an article telling you how to load paper into your writing machine. So that's, and then that was in 1868. There really were no great advances in calligraphy. The calligraphy I showed you, the American Penman, the resolutions, that continued all the way through, but there were no significant changes. And I'll hop back to the other side of the pond. This is the birth of the modern calligraphy movement. This is what set us up to be prepared for the digital age. Edward Johnston, William Morris, Rudolf von Lerisch, all influential in this movement. Part of the arts and crafts movement. And Edward Johnston's influences we can't say enough about his influence. And he published Writing, Lettering, and Illuminating, which is still a very influential book in what we do. And what I'm going to try to do here is chase a little lineage from him to today, to me. This is what connects us with the modern era of calligraphy. This is one of Edward Johnston's blackboards. Great analysis of the letter. What Edward Johnston did is he went back to the Carolingian hand. And he went back through many, many phases of history and analyzed how these letters had been created. Because believe it or not, it was largely forgotten. People saw these letters, they appreciated them, but nobody knew how they were actually taken apart, and the dictus, the order of strokes, and all that. And that was great research that he did. So I think by today's standards, it was all founded on what he taught us and what he sent down after that. But at the same time, and that's more of Edward Johnston's work, at the same time in Germany, we had Rudolf Koch. He began his career as an engraver, and he gravitated to the broad edge pen. He published a book, Technical Skills for Lettering, in 1921. The text was set entirely in black letter. That's not this. It included calligraphic instruction, book design, binding, certificate form, and a section of handwriting for children. So it was kind of his version of writing, lettering, and illuminating. Rudolf Koch also designed Neuland. This was designed as it was being cut into the metal without a drawn pattern in the early 20th century, 1923. I found it really interesting in my browsing through the internet to come through this, to come upon this. That's the detail. This is a Visigothic crown from the 7th century Europe. And it says around the bottom, it says King Rex offers this. This was his votive gift. But those look really Neuland-like to me. I thought it was really cool, and I wonder if Koch went back to those letters and saw them. Rudolf von Lerisch was also teaching very much like Edward Johnston at the same time in Germany. He taught writing and heraldry at the School of Applied Arts, and later at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. Then we come to Friedrich Poppel in Germany. I love this guy. He studied with Carl Georg Hofer, Hans Bahn, and Herbert Post at Werkenschule Offenbach. And he created a typeface called Pop Pontiff. I couldn't find it. But he created more typefaces than that too, but what I particularly like about him is that work on the right. He is credited with being the first one to use the technical ruling pen in a rather expressive manner. that has been argued that there was an American. Second bonus question, if anybody knows an American that did that before 1955. And okay, now we're going back to Edward Johnston, Eric Gill, student of Edward Johnston. He was a sculptor, an architect, a carver. He's an incredible artist, type designer and printmaker. And his work carries on and still inspires many of us and many type designers as well. He used humanist hand as the influence for this. He went back to the 15th century to get the influence for this hand. Grayley Hewitt was a student of Edward Johnston. He was very, very helpful in helping Edward Johnston write that classic book, Writing, Lettering, and Illuminating. And he's credited with reviving the art of gilding for calligraphers, like Edward Johnston did with letter shapes and how to create letters. Grayley Hewitt did the same thing with the gold techniques. He also spent a lot of time trying to link calligraphy and type design, arguing that type should represent the creations of the pen. It's his work, very clean. This is Irene Wellington's work. This really, her work inspired me early in my career for its integrity, its warmth. This is the thank you notes for neighbors. She was inspired by Edward Johnston. She was a teacher at the School for the Arts, Central School for Arts and Crafts, but she was not a student of his. But she, however, was the teacher to Donald Jackson and Anne Heckel. Donald Jackson, most of you, I'm sure, heard of for the St. John's Bible Project, as well as many other projects, and Anne Heckel, an influential calligrapher from the 60s on. More of Irene Wellington's work. She also, as well as her playful sense, had a real classic form as well. Good balance, use of many hands in a nice hierarchical order. It's classic and strong work. And here's Anne Heckel's work. She's wonderful with these beautiful, lively, drawn versals. So what I see in these two ladies' work, particularly that and this, is really getting away from, not really challenging legibility, but getting away from baselines, getting away from letter angles, getting away from structured letter sizes, and bringing a real human element into the work. And it's my belief in the 1970s even that by then we had easier type, and I think calligraphers' needs were to express more. We were getting less formal work already. These are two really interesting British artists who have the same last name, but I can't find that they're related. I don't believe they are. They're both associated with Eric Gill, living at the same time. Jonah Jones to the left and David Jones to the right. These two also very playful with classic letter forms, influential in the mid-20th century for us. And this is my teacher, Sheila Waters. One of my many teachers, but Sheila, I learned a lot of structure and letter form. She knows letter forms so well and historical influences. This is Sheila's work at the age of 12. And her teacher was Dorothy Mahoney, who was a student and an assistant to Edward Johnston. Here's Sheila's work when she was 18. Very clean. And this is perhaps one of her most popular pieces, most well-known pieces, The Roundel of the Seasons. This piece, its original it could possibly be 10 by 10 inches. It might be 12 by 12, but it's very, very small. And if you take that whole inside white circle, she had painted that as densely as everything else early on and didn't like it and scraped it all off the vellum and started again with scratch vellum. So, calligraphy is here. It's becoming much, much more, coming from a more artistic direction. We're writing in circles. We're using a lot of color. I think it's just opening up new opportunities. We don't have to be as literate as we had been for so many years. We're just starting to break those bonds. Arnold Banks, real influential artist in the American calligraphy movement in the 1970s. He taught at Carnegie Mellon from 1960 to 1984. He lectured at the Royal College of Art in London. He's often credited with sparking the calligraphy movement in America. He was certainly a very, very critical element of it. And he really pushed that concept of being freed from the reins of type and from the reins of calligraphy as a means of transmitting clear, concise thoughts and ideas. We could enter the age of expression. And he really started having fun with letters. So we're not quite up to the digital age yet, but because at this point already, you folks who know about type know that we got into phototype and earlier forms of printing and type before the digital age. It still took work away from calligraphers, you could say, or opened up opportunities for calligraphers to be much more expressive. Werner Schneider, he was a student of Friedrich Poppel. He became his assistant. Great type designer, and here's wonderful, and of course we couldn't talk about calligraphy in the digital age with Hermann Zapf, who has had a wonderful relationship with the San Francisco Public Library. He was honored here in 2001 with an exhibit, and many, many events apparently surrounding that visit, which was informally called Zapfest. Hermann Zapf, he got into calligraphy. It was actually a little bit hard. If you read about his life, Germany before the war, his family, his dad had been suspect and taken away from the family for a long period of time. He couldn't find work because of politics. Finally, of course, everything worked out fine for him in the end, but it took him a little while to get up and running. He worked for the type foundry Stempel. So he got the job at Stempel because they didn't ask for qualification certificates or references, but instead only required him to show his sketchbooks from the war and a calligraphic piece he did in 1944 on Hans von Weber's Dschungel Exzentent. Hans von Weber's work. That's how he got his first job, because he wasn't asked for any certificates or anything like that. They just looked at his pure work, and if you've seen his journals on the war, they're very moving and incredible art. He taught calligraphy at the Arts and Crafts School in Offenbach for 12 years, from 1948 to 1950. And well, let's see. So his career in type design spanned the three most recent stages of printing. He spanned hot metal composition, photo typesetting, or cold type, and digital typesetting. And he stayed ahead of it for each one of those things. I was around through the digital thing, and to watch him come up with digital fonts and be so ahead of the game. He came out to, in 1976, the Rochester Institute of Technology, and he taught some very memorable and informative and critical workshops there for several summers at Rochester. His ideas in the 1960s for using the computer to design type were laughed at in Germany until he got into Rochester, and Rochester understood where he was going and took him in. So great artist. And his type work is much larger than his calligraphy work, which is pretty big. And then we have our local artist, Thomas Ingmeyer, who has an incredible exhibit just around the corner here, this poetry. You've all got to go see that. His work just continues to push the envelope in expressive work. He really has rounded that corner. And is coming at his work as much from a painterly direction as a formal calligraphy direction. And if you look in that show, he's included music into it now, and the music is every bit as instrumental in this design that he's doing these days. Absolutely wonderful work. That's all of his work. And I was mentioning how through history, calligraphy represents architecture of the day. So I had to throw Frank Gehry in there with Thomas Ingmeier. So at the same time, that's just a few modern calligraphers I've talked about there, and there's no way I could cover them all. I tried to cover people who were either my teachers or this direct link from me to Edward Johnston three generations back. But we're still doing this. There's a great movement in America for the older styles. The American penmanship movement is actually more alive and well now than it was in the 1980s, for certain. The IAMPETH group has grown leaps and bounds in the past 15 years or so. And maybe that in itself is a response to the digital age. A lot of this modern calligraphy and pointed pen stuff is a means of these people to get away from the nice, tight, strict, formal hands that we see. Another example of modern calligraphy still holds beautiful, traditional, formal value. I don't know the artist of this, but it's the Instrument of Consent for Harry and Kate. And Gemma Black. Gemma is she's a calligrapher from Tasmania, Australia. I appreciate her modern work, for she has a real sense of formal design, thorough knowledge of materials and techniques, and she incorporates good, strong design in her work. That reminds me to go back to Thomas Ingmeier. I've shown you this work of his, but it has to be noted he was the first American to be elected to the Society of Scribes and Illuminators in England in 1976 or 77. His foundations are incredibly strong, and if you asked him to do anything formal like that, I don't know that he would want to, but he has all the skills required, that's for sure. And we'll spend a little bit of time showing you how the digital age has affected my work. This is the stuff I did in Washington. In 1998, I got to the White House, and it was a February day, and I walked into the office. I'd been there, of course, but there were no computers. 1998. So the thinking in the office up to that point had been, we're the calligraphy office. If they bring in computers, we're dead. And it was clear to me that, of course, if we don't have computers, we're really dead. So I asked for a computer, and they got me a computer within a matter of hours. It was a nice little PC, but I wanted a Mac. So 3 months later, I got a Mac. And that started the calligraphy of the White House. And that allowed this kind of work to be done in-house, scanned, and sent as a PDF to an engraver, and we would get the finished product. Prior to that, I would have to do the board art and bundle it up and have a courier go through security, drive across town, go through security at the White House, pick up the board art, drive it back to the printer, do the job, and bring it back. So the digital age helped production in that office tremendously. It also, it didn't harm our jobs at all. It helped our jobs tremendously. The mock-ups we could do of the First Lady and the President are, quick and accurate and clean. Like I said, the transmission of information in files, and the work that we created could be used on the White House website, could be used in other means. We could do that original art, scan it in, and use it for signage and invitations and booklets and programs. So, we embraced it very much. There were 3 of us, none of us. When I said we needed a computer, it wasn't because I knew how to use it. None of us knew how to use it. And I remember several nights being in there at midnight trying to figure out which key that was that I was supposed to do. And I learned Quark Express, and as soon as I learned it, it seemed Adobe InDesign was coming up stronger, so I had to relearn a whole new thing. But that's computers. This is the sort of stuff this is Washington. It was legible, there were formal hands. This happens to be a marriage of typesetting and calligraphy, nice marriage of both. Another kind of a Washington type thing, formal certificates, formal hands. So in 2008, I gave it all up and moved back to Cape Cod to make letters like I wanted to. And I started, I really did live in a very structured calligraphy world during those 20 years in Washington. So I started breaking out in design, and I'll show you kind of what's happened over the past few years with that. This is inspired by hiking the Pacific Crest Trail with my wife. And that watercolor wash at the background is all the elevation changes on the Pacific Crest Trail. It goes from Mexico to Canada with 80 significant places to stop along the way. Also inspired by that hike was this interpretation of Mary Oliver's poem, Sleeping in the Forest. And this was a whole new thing for me to get away from formal scripts and to start to add a little life to my work. And I embrace it absolutely, just absolutely love it. I find it a challenge, a welcome challenge. This is a poem about the sea, so it's just trying to capture that feeling of the sea by overlapping text and changing hues. I did a body of work on the sea because I love the ocean. I thought the hands that we choose, italic, the breezy water, the moving water, which this one here just kind of having a playful, strong feel. And then here, I felt like this poem was a proclamation to Poseidon. It's called They Who Possess the Sea. And I thought that the writer was proclaiming her absolute absorption of the ocean into her life. So I felt I wanted that color of blood at the top, and I wanted it to be strong, so I chose a Gothic hand, which I thought was strong, yet I wanted it to have some motion, like the seaweed moving under the water, so I kind of had fun with flourishes where I could. I did this poem in 3 different renditions, but I don't have the others with me, but this is an interpretation of a Robert Frost poem. Robert Frost grew up in San Francisco, and his dad swam in the bay every single day. And he was out there one day. Robert Frost was 9 years old on the beach. His dad was out swimming, and a squall came in. And later in life, he remembered the fear he was feeling for his dad out in that with the storm coming across. And I tried to capture that through these colors and textures, and kind of like Monet's haystacks, I revisit it and come up with it in entirely different ways each time I visit it. This is a poem called Light by Tagore. And it's a little bit like the Mary Oliver piece in that it's round and bright, but it's got this radiating feel that I created through compressing the letters and accentuating the radiation, the radial more. So then I was inspired by this man, Andrew van der Merwe, in South Africa. This is carved in the sand. He works with tribal alphabets in Africa, and his work is just unbelievably beautiful. In 2008, I was inspired by his work and tried to figure out how he did it and started playing myself with it. This is lettering. This is done, it looks like incised lettering. And if you've ever written in the beach with a stick, you get all that debris on the side, and it doesn't have a nice V cut to it like this does. That's done by a special pair of plywood shoes that I built, and Andrew built some too, with the ends curling up, and a bucket with a plywood base where the ends curl up so you don't leave any footprints, and you scoop the dirt into the bucket for each stroke of the letter. After playing with that for a while, I discovered Andreas Amador from the San Francisco area, who does his large-scale beach art. So being out in Cape Cod, this work, if you do large-scale beach art, the sun has to be behind that for you to see it. So if you do that in Cape Cod, you have to wake up at 3 in the morning, do 2 hours of scratching in the dark, and hope you get it all right with the tide going out and the sun coming up. And that was my first attempt. And it was just so much fun. I go off and do more. This is a 1/4-mile long calligraphy piece in the sand. It goes along the Cordham Trail. There's a bluff up above that so you could read this Herman Melville quote about the sea. And let's see if I can. This is a practice. The ocean washed it away before I finished. Drone. Yeah. By the way, I'm looking for a videographer to help me do. If anybody knows a videographer who would love to collaborate with me, let me get in touch. So, having worked with these letters anywhere from 1/8 of an inch to 1.5 inches or so for 40 years, I really know them intimately, at this scale. And when you bring it up to 8 or 10 foot letters, it becomes a full body activity and it becomes a dance. It's absolutely wonderful to feel letters at that scale.
How tall are they about?
They're getting, I'm cheating there, they're getting a little small. They look about 6 feet there, but conceals are probably around 7 or 8 feet. Yep. So with the digital age, there's no way I could shoot that work. So kind of nice. And then we go back to the caves. This is Banksy. And that's the end of the story. It continues. Thank you.